So the agenda for today is we're going to go over the goals of the flow that we're building, and then we'll dive into and review the automated flow itself. And then at the end, we'll have a Q&A session. So essentially the purpose of the flow was to eliminate the customer's manual process and any human error that comes with a manual process by automating an interviewing process. Now, one of the most important things whenever you're building something or going to automate something is understanding the requirements. It helps you determine what your goal is. It helps you to determine um, how the flow is going to be triggered, what information you may need to find through the course of the flow. It helps you to determine, is there going to be any supporting fields that you need to create? And then ultimately, what is the outcome and where will that be stored? So this flow in particular, the requirement was that we were going to auto-generate SUMO appointment links that would be then sent through an automated process with an email where it would provide that link to whoever was the participant of that interview. Now, because I know SUMO, I know that if I try to create a SUMO appointment link outside of through our code, like, just the back end and generate the records that are associated, that there are about 10 or so fields that are required that you have to populate with specific information. It has to be formatted in a certain way, or its IDs, things like that, in order for that record or the link that comes from that record to function appropriately. I also know that because there's a lot of IDs that are housed on that record, and that there is different things that change between orgs, that I'm going to need some to find a lot of information through my flow, so that I'm not hard coding anything, whether that be IDs or portions of a link, like the domain, for instance. Also, any field that does require an ID should have a way for me to reference that information or to grab that ID from somewhere, whether that's from a field on a record or something along those lines, so that it all functions correctly. And if something needs to change, like who the host is or something like that, they just update a field and now the host will change on that link when the next time it's generated, etc. So to automate, let's dive into the flow. So I actually created two flows for this. There is a subflow and then the main flow. Now, the subflow itself, this is what is creating the appointment link records specifically, and it needs to create two. And with each record, you also have to populate a link on that record after the record has been created, because we need the ID of that record as a part of that link in order for that link to reference the details or all the key points for that particular link. In addition to that, there is an additional object record that is created called invite attendee. And that is how we determine who the host is and who maybe the primary attendee is for this particular, whatever appointments are going to be created from this link. So I had to create records and then update fields on those records. So this flow is going to be launched by another flow. So it's just an auto-launched flow. And then I've created some elements within inside the flow to create certain things. So let's take a look at the first one. So the first one is being used to create a record. And we're using separate resources and values. Now I created some supporting fields at the record level, and that just happened to work out that way because that was something that they needed to populate from their side, as far as like the date range which the appointment was going to be scheduled for or between. They also wanted to define a different duration between the two links. So one link might be a 30-minute duration, the second link might be 60, but that can change it's not a static value, so they wanted there to be a place on the record that this is being generated from or for that to be a value they could populate, and then we would create these links for them. So we went ahead and created some supporting records or fields that was like duration, start and end dates. It was who the interviewer was going to be, and also, yeah, those were the ones that we created. Now, there are some things that have static values. So record type, that changes between orgs. So this is something that we're going to have to go find at some point, so that when I take this flow and I push it to production, that all just works. It goes and finds the correct ID for what is in production. And then it also works as they refresh sandboxes. This functionality all works because I don't have any IDs that are hard coded into the flow. So here, because these values are going to change from link to link, I actually created some resources or variables for all of the fields that I'm going to later point from my main flow to a specific place to grab that information from. So I went ahead and created variables for the process ID, the record type, the customer from the case, the durations from the case, the interviewer from the case, start and end dates. I created a lot of variables. And what I did for these variables is I made them available for input. So whatever the data type is based on the field type. So if it's text, then the data type is text. If it's a date time field, then the data type is date time, etc. But I made them available outside of this flow because this is a subflow. And I'm going to actually decide what those values or I'm going to have the input come from somewhere else in my other flow. So these are all available for input. Now, here I am creating the first record. I choose what the object is. I decide all the fields I have to populate. Most of these are required for this to function. Now, the appointment type is like the title. It's called interview. Now that is static, so this value is hard-coded. It'll always be interview. Another thing that was static or hard-coded was the availability option, because they decided that they were always going to use the same availability option because we have 3 different ones, and they decided on only using this one. Now, these are all those variable fields where I've just created, like, this is a number field to capture the duration. This is a date time field to capture the end date for that date range. Now, another thing that was static was going to be the location details. So that's hard coded. Now, this value is very specific because it's something that our code has to read. It is case sensitive, etc. Same with this location type, because all of these appointments are going to be done virtually, so this could be hard coded. Now, if there was a need for them to make that decision up front, it would have also required that to be defined, or for us to be able to determine that based on criteria or something that we could also build out in the flow. In this case, it was all going to be the same, so we got to hard code it. Again, these are just referencing fields from the variables and stuff, because I'm going to input information into them later, so on and so forth. Now, after the record is created, because we have to wait for that ID, then we have to come back to the record and update it. And we have to update that record with the ID from the record itself. We'll have to update a field to include an invite link is formatted in a certain way. So it contains like your org domain, and it contains like the record ID from the SUMO appointment link record itself. So this is creating that here. This is also a variable field, but we are pulling all this information in here, and then I'm going to decide what those values are in the other flow. Here we are creating a record. This is creating a record from a separate object. It is an object that is related to the SUMO appointment links object. This is a child record, so to speak. Each record, each appointment link should have at least one of these records created. for the host. It will always have one for the host. And then it may have one for the participant, depending on whether you have to find a participant or not, or if the participant is going to input their information themselves. Now, this again, variables here, these are the two fields that have to be populated in order for this record to be created. And I have given them some I've created the variables for those and put them here. Now I've done this twice for creating this record because I created one for the primary attendee and I created one, or three. I created one for the primary attendee and I created one for the first host and one for the secondary host because this is a panel interview. So these are the same. They're just referencing different values, fields for values later. Now I'm creating two different records. So I repeat that process again for the second link. And that second link is going to reference some different stuff. So for instance, you'll notice that when I create this record, I'm now referencing case duration 2 for this particular record because it's going to have a different duration associated with it. The rest of the stuff is pretty much the same. That was the only difference that between the two is that it was going to be a different duration for that interview. And again, create those same records. Now that this is all set, I can now use this subflow in my flow that is going to be triggered based on a case record being created. Now, there was some criteria that needed to be inputted because we wanted to make sure that we were not creating a dead link. Now, by dead link, that means if there's no host associated to this link, it will not work. There has to be at least a host associated to it. So we needed to make sure that when that case record was created, that the interviewer fields were also populated. Otherwise, because the flow wasn't going to be set to be based on it being updated, because we're not going to go back and update these links, it should be based on this would only be created as long as these two fields were populated. And later, this honestly ended up changing to it being updated because we later determined that the record would exist first and then they would populate these fields. So we made some changes later, but this was a POC, so we're just going to go based on what originally was stated. Now, we are setting this to actions and related records. And the reason for that is because I'm actually going to have to go out and find information, and the record that we're actually creating in here, it's not associated, the object isn't associated to a case. So I'm not going to be updating the case record or anything like that. I'm creating and updating completely separate stuff. Next up would be some of the things that I had to find. Now, because the process record in SUMO, you can have multiple processes. We need to know which one we're using for this to create these links. So this one is going to go out and look to this object where that record is stored, or those details are stored, and it's going to go find a process with a specific name. And this name will be the same in all of their instances, even when they copy, etc., to make sure we're using the right process. And this is to find the ID of this process because we need to reference that later. Next up would be finding the appointment link record type. So we do have two record types for appointment links, and we needed to make sure that we were capturing the correct one, and we needed it to be an invite link. And the reason for that is because they had a scenario in which they may not add a participant, and so it would be an open link that they could use for multiple people. But the other record type that we have does not allow that. You have to actually have a participant for that one. So in this case, we went and found the field where that would be housed and how to capture or find record types. And it's a developer name. So from this particular object where the value is this. So object is record type, the field we're looking for the value, and then this is the value that we're looking for. And then we're saving all of the fields from that particular record so we can recall them later if necessary. Get the domain site. So this one was kind of difficult there was a lot of trial and error that happened with getting the domain, just because it wasn't something easy to find. But we needed to go and find the base of the scheduling process link. And essentially what that is like your domain is listed here up in your browser. But depending on the number of domains that you have in your org, because you can have multiple technically, we needed to find the correct one. So here is where we went and looked for the scheduling process from our process records previously, then to find the site URL. So here we went and found the process record. On this record, there's a field called site URL that's storing the stuff that I need. So I'm recalling that information here to go and get the URL or the site ID so that I can have that base link available to me later. This is our subflow. This is where after we find all of this information, because I'm going to reference those fields later, and those details from within this flow here inside of the subflow. So here I input the subflow, I picked which flow is going to be my subflow. Now I need to include all the fields that I need to add a value for, and I'm going to reference certain things. So for the process ID, here I'm referencing the ID from where I found the process. So I went to this naming convention because it's where I found it. That's a record I'm looking for. And from the record I found, now I want the ID. And that's what this is doing. Same thing applies for the record type ID. I went and found to that component or element and said, I want the ID from the record I found here. Case customer, now this is from the case object that is triggering the flow. So I found the contact ID because it's the customer that's associated with that case. There's a duration field on the case record that I'm referencing, and this is for the first link, so it's the duration 1. Here is for the second link, duration. It's specifically the second duration level there. This is also from the case record, and it's just a date time field. This is from the case interviewer. This is actually a formula. I'll explain why that's a formula in a second. Start time, same thing. It's coming from the case record because they had a supporting field. Interviewer, case record, supporting field. I want to update a value within the appointment link record so that they relate back to the case. So that's coming, the ID from the case record is coming in here. And then here we need to construct that URL, and this is a formula as well, and I will show you that in a second. But these are all the things I'm including, and these are how I'm determining the values that are going to then be based on those variables that I made available for input. This is what it's going to input in there. So where I mention the variable case duration 1, it's going to populate that with this field. Where I mentioned the variable case duration 2, it's going to populate it with this detail. That way I could assign 2 different values in those records, and then they're being created. Now I have different elements and variables and formulas that I created in here as well. I had to create a formula to construct the URL and a formula for the first interviewer. So through the course of the conversation with the client, I asked some pretty pointed questions just about record creation, and was there ever going to be, could he see a time where a person if there's only one interviewer, if the person might accidentally populate interviewer 2 instead of interviewer 1 and leave interviewer 1 blank. And he said they shouldn't, but I mean, human error happens and it's possible. So what we did here was to determine interviewer 1 would be to look at both fields, see if interviewer 1 is blank, and then interviewer 2 is give me interviewer 2. If interviewer 1 and 2 are populated, then give me interviewer 1 if it's, as the first interviewer, to get around that. Constructing the URL, we needed to just create a formula, make it text, because this domain site ID stuff was it's not everything we needed. We constructed a formula to essentially construct the URL that needs to be added to the records in order for them to function appropriately. But I'm referencing different fields where I went and found a record, found the domain, got the domain, then I'm inserting some path stuff, and finally, then there's some text in there as well. So we have some other variables here. So we have where we're doing the second invite record. We have, these are all like getting records, stuff like that. The appointment link 1 and appointment link 2, they needed to be created because of how the order of operations that's happening in Salesforce, because I later need to, within the subflow, go ahead and use them here so that it's storing those output values, and we're manually assigning variables to them because in order to come back and later we need to update that record, and it wasn't doing it without making them manually assign the variables previously when we first started to build the flow. All right, once all that's done, the next thing is to go and update that case, the same case that triggered the flow, with those URLs. So they're right here. It uses that formula I did to construct the URL, and then I'm passing in the second invite record ID and the first invite record ID. And then it's going and updating the 2 records we just created, the 2 links we created, and so they'll function appropriately. All right, so those are how I built out my 2 flows. I am now going to show it to you in action. So I'm going to go to the case record. It's not what I wanted. I'm going to create a new case, and then I'll show you the fields that I created as well. So I need to pick my contact. I'm going to pick Sally. Let's pick this arbitrarily, doesn't matter. I'm going to pick the 25th at 12, and then the 25th through, we'll say 5 p.m. Interviewer 1 and interviewer 2. I'm going to pick these people. Yeah, that should be fine. Now this is where the appointment links are going to be populated, but I do need to present the duration for each of these here. And then I need to fill out the other required fields on here, which doesn't make a difference. We'll save that. And you'll notice the links are populated. So now I'm going to go launch the link because it did all the stuff. You can see this is my link that I constructed here. And you can see that it shows both participants or both interviewers. It has my participants. And when I go click on, and then you have the availability that you can pick here. And those are the links that we created. Now, if I wanted to go see these link records, I could just go look at a link record within Salesforce to show you the records that I generated. So this is what I created with the flow. It's just a record, but how are all these things matter on here? So you'll notice the date, start date, time that I picked is here. Here's the IDs that populated because I created records, values that were populated based on static information. The duration for this one was the 30. Here's how it relates back to the case. And then there's other records that we created were here. This is the records we created so that the host, the 2 interviewers, and the participant would be included because those were additionally required. And that kind of sums up how we go ahead and generate or automate flows for appointment links. Let's move on to Q&A.